Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me this Friday. I'm Greg Swartz. I'm the big man half of the Big Man We Dram. This is the We Dram, which we'll get to in a minute. And I would like to say that I'm really excited today to have today's guest because I've actually known him for more than a year now. And also, I'm really curious about what he's doing right now. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about that. My guest is Andrew Moldenhauer, who works for the Beverage Testing Institute in Chicago. And we're going to learn a little bit about that. And we're also going to talk about the state of whiskey in the world and some world whiskeys, maybe from places that aren't quite as obvious as Scotland or Ireland or the US. So without further ado, please welcome Andrew.
Hey, Greg. Hey. Thank you so much for having me today. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you for joining me, man. I'm looking forward to it.
As you said, had the chance to know you for a couple of years now. It's been great to hang out with some other whiskey nerds and always talk whiskey. For those who don't know, Greg and I know each other through the Executive Whiskey Club and the Water of Life, obviously. My former background is being a brand ambassador with Bruichladdich and Remy Cointreau, Pernod Ricard on their full whiskey portfolio, cognac portfolio, champagnes before that, Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, and Macallan as a junior brand ambassador. So that's basically my last decade in the world of whiskey, a little bit of dabbling in wine, and now here at the Beverage Testing Institute within the last year.
Kind of quite a journey.
Yeah, so kind of what that entails is getting away from the brand life. For those of you who don't necessarily know all the brand ambassador stuff, not traveling 80% of the year, no more of the serving drinks at clubs until 2 a.m. So as much fun as that is, it's nice to take a step back and focus more on the academics of whiskey, academics of alcohol in general, get back to a little bit more of that writing background, and not have to be beholden to one portfolio. It's as much as I love Bruichladdich and some of the other brands, wouldn't work for brands that I didn't love and passionately want to represent. There's always other things in the portfolio that you either can't speak poorly of or you can't sing the praises of other brands and other whiskeys that are doing great things because you're kind of tied to that corporate overlord of have to stick to one brand and not talk about how cool the competitors are.
Yeah. It's funny. When I was just in Canada in January, I was talking to one of the brand reps when we were in Victoria, and he said that he actually have traveled so often that he kept suitcases at a couple of the 4 or 5 hotels around Canada that he was constantly visiting. So he didn't have to travel with suitcases. He actually had, I guess for some small fee, some hotels will keep your suitcase for you.
I've definitely experienced that, whether it's just for a couple of days, on a layover, leave things around. Kind of feel like you're prepping for the zombie apocalypse where you kind of have go bags scattered in different major metropolitan areas. I can completely identify with that feeling.
I definitely can see here we have some Chicago presence watching this because Paul Barrett said whiskey's cool, so is chartreuse and Malort. The only people ever talk about Malort are in Chicago.
Well, Paul and I will disagree on the coolness of Malort as much as it's a staple, but no debating green chartreuse and our mutual passion for that.
It's funny. I don't know that I've ever had chartreuse outside of a cocktail, except I have to admit once as a teenager. One of my friends had a bottle of it, and I remember drinking it in my parents' garage. So with all the sophistication that was warranted.
Well, we'll have to change that when you're next in Chicago. We can do a yellow versus green and some of the VEPs, tasting comparison there. Definitely has become one of those industry, handshake kind of things, along with Fernet and Malort as well. As if you're ordering that dram at a bar, people typically know that you're in this business.
Yeah. I had an amazing cocktail. God, where was I? San Francisco. I was in San Francisco back in July, and I had an incredible gin cocktail that had green chartreuse in it, and I can't remember what it was called. It was like that bar's cocktail. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard of before.
Yeah,
it was awesome.
The Morris in San Francisco is one of my all-time favorite bars, restaurants. They're one of the biggest chartreuse accounts in the world. And not only do they have an incredible backlog of chartreuse going back, every decade over the last century, but they also have a couple of specialty chartreuse on draft and have a chartreuse slushy as their house cocktail.
Wow. Well, that's a commitment.
Great whiskey and wine bar too. They have a good collection of awesome single malts, so they're a good all around option. But can't escape that green chartreuse passion.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of which, so now, I mean, your portfolio isn't really a portfolio anymore, right? I mean, you kind of explore, experiment, taste, and represent everything.
Yeah, so it's been a great opportunity to kind of leverage my background, people that I've met over the years, hopefully bring them in as clients or bring them back in as clients. The Beverage Testing Institute's been around for just over 40 years, looking at products academically. So it's a great opportunity to have 10,000 plus bottles here in the archives, go back and compare what was Highland Park 25 like back from the mid 90s against current examples, and really be able to check in and say, quality control, that the product is the same or the product's changed a little bit, but it's changed for the better, it's changed for the worse. Maybe qualitatively it's pretty much the same, just the flavors have altered over the years. But being a wine guy as well as a whiskey guy, it's really a cool look at vintages of whiskey, and how humans, technology, source ingredients all kind of affect that terroir and flavor year after year, rather than just assuming that it's a stable product.
It's really fun to do that as well. I mean, it's cool that you get to do it professionally, but it's just, just the other day on a whim, I realized I had 3 different vintages of Bruichladdich Isle Barley. And I was like, I'm going to drink those one after another. And I sat down and I had all 3, and, and I understand some distilleries like Bruichladdich really embraces the fact that they're not the same. Like they don't try to sort of cram it into a box with coloring it or whatever, they're going to let it be its own thing. But it was, and obviously, look, they're not that different. They vary a bit within a really kind of a nice parameters. You know what I mean? With relatively tight parameters.
Well, and there's that back and forth. Is like you're looking for the fingerprint, the DNA of the distillery to come through, and then you're looking, what makes the small, minute differences year after year or batch after batch.
Yeah,
but. It's fascinating. When I was still with Pernod Ricard years ago, I started sitting on panels here at the Beverage Testing Institute because I am based out of Chicago, and had opportunities to start doing things like, let's taste Jack Daniels from the 1970s and taste one bottle of Jack Daniels from every decade over the last 5 decades, and how much has it changed? How much is it oxidation in the bottle, or have the opportunity to pop brand new bottles and just say, where has the process changed? Same thing, tasting Johnny Walker Black Label. As much as you can guarantee a product stays similar batch to batch, or 1972 to 1973, by the time that you're looking at 72 versus 94, you're looking at different blenders, different people in the process. Most of the time they're just trying to keep a consistent product one year to the next. But it's a game of telephone at that point, especially with the blending. Where is it changing decade to decade?
That's fascinating. When I was, you remember, okay, so I don't want to get all inside baseball on people who don't. So over the summer, I spent a week in Kentucky. Andrew knows that because you hooked me up with some places to go. We talked about possibly meeting when I was there. And I got to try a Jim Beam, I guess in the mid 70s when whiskey was kind of at its absolute nadir. Jim Beam started doing all those funky bottlings, like the race cars. And I had, the one guy had like an old time telephone, but it was a whiskey bottle. And we were drinking Jim Beam from like 1975, and it was really cool just sort of comparing it to a contemporary release of the same thing and how it's changed and how it's not. And plus it's spent, not only is it that old in a bottle, it's in a really weird bottle. I don't know that that's going to have any impact on it, but I also don't know how those bottles are, if they're quite as
those decanters
well
are becoming a point of question over the years with collectors are showing up at auction too.
Yeah, I think they're mostly, the people who collect them are more for what it is than what's in it, right? I mean, because I know they did that whole Corvette series.
My understanding originally, it was like, back in the 70s and 80s when they were doing that, and whiskey wasn't selling, it was decorative. All of a sudden when you're finding, old Stitzel Weller juice in one of those, people are clamoring over them to go get these really awesome old bottles. And then, is the porcelain tainted with lead? What was in the paint? How are they aging for 40 plus years in a weird ceramic decanter that was never actually meant for long-term aging?
Yeah, exactly. But this, I gotta say, the whiskey had held up. mind you, that was pretty deep into an evening. So I don't know that my palate was not, fresh.
Yeah, there's some really cool stuff out there. And I mean, obviously Kentucky, we're all chasing what is the next bourbon, all the new distilleries that are being built in Kentucky. That's fascinating too, of just watching the whiskey world develop, not just looking backwards, but looking forwards. And kind of your question earlier about what do I do here, that's a big part of why I came over to this team, was looking at the past of whiskey, where is the present, and having at least some sort of influence on the future, not just with individual brands. But we also do consulting here as well. Before brands ever hit the market, we're tasting distillate, we're tasting single barrels, we're working with different brands behind the scenes to help them make the best possible product and bring it to market.
So to that end, let me ask you a question. Are you guys, one of the things I keep hearing people say, I have no scientific data to go with this, I just hear people say it a lot, that a lot of the new distilleries in Scotland, for example, that are coming online, their whiskeys have been designed on paper before they were ever in a bottle or a cask to be non-age statement whiskeys. This isn't like can we release this at 5? This was designed to be released at 5. Like they kind of went with a distillate that would work with a really aggressive wood, that it's going to get them where they want to be sooner, so they don't have to sit on their first releases for 10 years. And non-age statement whiskeys in Scotland are becoming pretty common now. And but people keep saying, oh well, they plan for this. They plan for this. It's the barley variety, the yeast variety, the cut points in the distillate, the cask types. Everything is chosen to be 4 or 5 year ready, as opposed to 10. Do you guys do stuff like that and work with?
We do some stuff like that too. Depending on what the client's needs are, what they're looking at. Going back a little bit more than 10 years ago, one of our clients that we work a lot with is Kavalan out of Taiwan. So, kind of the footprint that Dr. James Swan has had on the industry, starting single malt distilleries all over the world, and then looking at what's the quality of the product coming out of these distilleries. What is the barley? What is the distillate? Where are the casks? Obviously, what are the aging conditions? Someplace like Taiwan is obviously built around, you need to make whiskey that's going to age quickly. Otherwise, it's going to evaporate and you're going to have nothing left in the barrel.
Right. Well, so speaking of Kavalan, I actually didn't get some out, but you and I, one of the things we're going to talk about today is whiskey that has no past, whiskey that's all about the future, that are, whiskey is spread around the world and has all these new countries that are making it or at least really embracing it more than they've ever done before. And so I really wanted to talk about, a little bit about the world of whiskey, as we said, as you and I discussed ahead of time. And I know we're both talked about German whiskey. So I've got myself a Dram here, Paul, of elk whiskey from Elchbräu, the brewery in Germany, in Tuesbrunn. Yeah.
I've got 2 German single malts here. One from a German distillery, Blaumaus, started in 1983. So they've been around a little while, kind of going back with the history of single malt and barley production we were talking about. And the other one is a newer one, the Eiffel whiskey that I picked up when I was in Saratoga with another one of your guests, Charles from First Fill Spirits.
Nice. Charles is in Japan right now. Speaking of other whiskey countries, he's on a whiskey tour of Japan right now.
That's what he was telling me. I caught him a couple days before he was flying out.
Nice. Here our friend Guy Satchwell, he said that's exactly what Jim Swan advised Nick Nan to do. They ended up with a surprisingly good 4-year. Yeah, I mean that seems to be across the board with Jim Swan's kind of approach to things. Every time I hear someone do an STR cask, I know it's a Jim Swan advised distillery.
Well, cheers.
Cheers, man. Prost. I poured that a little while ago and let it sit, and I'm really glad I did, because it's 60% ABV. Really got to open up in the glass.
Heat there.
Yeah.
Yeah, as regarding Scotland with the new distilleries, it's kind of interesting because you would think most of them should be built for long-term aging and looking at things that way. But yeah, if you're not producing a vodka or gin, if you don't have a short-term revenue source, you have to go back and forth and make those philosophical choices along with evaluate what your funding looks like. and what kind of product are you gearing towards? I think the last thing anybody wants is to go back to the early 80s and have another whiskey lock situation. And yet, when we talk about back and forth in the world of whiskey, that kind of water of life, my background with Bruichladdich, since 2001, we've got almost 40 different single malt distilleries that have popped up in Scotland in the last 20 years. That's incredible growth. And, how are they all going to sustain it is definitely the question.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a question we just got asked. Christopher Malloy said, is the whiskey growing enough to the extent that all these distilleries have the potential to be? I mean, I don't think all of them do, right? I mean, it's not long-term anyway. That's just my, I've seen what's happening in craft beer now. There's so many closures or mergers or almost, Modern Times was in and out of bankruptcy. Sam Adams and Dogfish Head merging, so many are getting snapped up. There's 3 in LA, the really good breweries that went out of business in the last year. And I'm sad, but I think that means it's healthy, right? I mean, that means there's grows and expands and grows, and just like the wood, just like the whiskey and the wood.
Absolutely. And again, that kind of growth and expansion and retraction process, it's interesting in craft beer how it's gone. There's definitely arguments that some breweries, wanted to grow too big, too fast, push too far, and that's what caused their downfall rather than not being a good product. So, me personally, whether it's craft beer or it's whiskey, I think a large part of the way forward is focusing on focusing on terroir, like looking at barley strains and local woods and things that are interesting and regional, rather than trying to necessarily push out a 4-year-old product for a global market that you think you can make into a 1 million case brand. That's something that I think is going to be a real struggle for a lot of these distilleries. And, if that's what their goals are, don't think that's going to happen for a lot of them.
The one thing I have a pretty involved familiarity with Gordon and MacPhail. They were really generous to us when we were shooting the film, and we got to spend a lot of time there. And they're obviously one of the most consistent, probably the most consistent independent bottler in the industry. Mm-hmm. And distillery. Now they own 2. Well, now 1 and 3. They're about to open the cairn, and they bought Ben Romick. One of the things that they do, I've been asked this. I don't know why anyone would want my opinion on this, but I have been asked, like, what should a distillery do to plan if there's another whiskey lock? And I said, well, to me, the thing that Gordon and MacPhail did that was so brilliant is they didn't panic. They had enough resources to sit on that cushion and keep that stock while it wasn't popular, because God knows it became gold, more than gold. Mm-hmm. After, I don't know the number, but I know that Gordon and MacPhail owned dozens and dozens of Macallan casks throughout the entire whiskey lock. They just sat on them. I mean, and then I know that I think this is a pretty well-known thing. I know they sold a bunch of them back to Macallan.
Yep.
A few years back for a very, very, very healthy. Yeah.
Well, and that's one of those things. I think, we're all talking, what is the next Pappy Van Winkle, or what's the next, boom in whiskey, like, bourbon caught up on people. And, why we're talking about new whiskeys today, as I really think it's the global expansion, particularly of single malt, but whiskey in general. You're looking at Pernod and Diageo, who have invested hundreds of millions of dollars building single malt distilleries in China. You've got 3 societies that just opened up in South Korea. You've got Australia and New Zealand producing single malt. So, 6 major distilleries, operating in India, and that's the biggest single malt, consuming country on the planet. So, growth is there. I think opportunity is there. But I think it's going to be regionally focused to a certain degree and playing off those independent regional flavors, which for us as drinkers is fascinating to play with the whole world of whiskey, literally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you and I were talking about Germany, and there's, because I'm drinking the ale now, and then I've got the same from St. Killian. There's more and more German single malt that's kind of coming online all the time right now, and I think they have the resources because, well, they have the traditions, like the sort of distilling traditions and the brewing traditions, but they also have the like you said to me earlier, the water, the barley, it's all there, and mm-hmm. Now it's just the sort of the tradition.
Well, and I'm super curious whether it's like Austria, Germany, Switzerland, they have a long tradition not only of having the beer, but having beer schnapps, which is, for all intents and purposes, just whiskey, but by a different name, by a different culture, and how that kind of developed over the centuries, but never really became popular the way that Scottish or Irish whiskey did.
Yeah.
And yet,
And now,
when that translates to early American history, you have the Scotch, Irish, German brewers, distillers, growing, distilling here in Kentucky. So, it's there. The ingredients are there to be another fascinating product on the global scene.
Yeah. And now it's just about expertise and doing it the right way.
Yep.
Okay. So we've got some questions here that Christopher Malloy said that, the average customer is being priced out with Scotch at least. And, I think that's why so many of these distilleries are doing non-age statement releases now, because it's a way of still offering a cheaper product. I just saw Ralphie's new review this week was the Rioja, Lecheg Rioja, which is a non-age statement Lecheg. But to their credit, what Tobermory's managed to do with Lecheg is that's a non-chill filtered 46% non-age statement whiskey that's like, I think he said it was 28 pounds a bottle, so I think it's a way to do it in a way that's keeping it without becoming a 60, 70 pound bottle everywhere across the board.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely getting expensive. And I think that's the reason why you see a lot of whiskey consumers who, are kind of more avant-garde getting into brandies, be it cognac and Armagnac, be it rum, getting into agave distillates and looking for other alternatives for interesting and authentic spirits that aren't going to cost the arm and a leg that Scotch and bourbon prices are hitting.
Yeah.
And to your point with the non-age statements, why you're seeing more and more distilleries open up, regionally and provide younger product to try to bring people in, at an affordable price point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that maybe trying to play big isn't the right way to go. I mean, what are you going to do? Compete with Diageo?
Yeah. I think, and I can't speak for everybody, but I think kind of the hope there is to, be interesting enough and just get big enough that, your 20-year plan is to sell to one of the big guys. Don't want to say that
I think a lot of them have.
Yeah, but that seems to be the way that it's going is, if you're a High West, follow that kind of trajectory is just get big enough, popular enough that you can, see a return on your investment and get out of the market.
Well, Balcones, Wilderness Trail in the same week, I think, right?
Exactly.
That's your 401k, right? I mean, that's your retirement plan right there is sell your distillery for $400 million.
Or undisclosed sum, but Screwball just sold. I mean, talk about a crazy trajectory, just flavored whiskey started in 2018, and selling the brand to Pernod Ricard 5 years later.
Yeah. That's
not
nuts.
That as a passionate lover of aged whiskeys and all things barrels, not necessarily endorsing the creation of sourced flavored whiskey and get out of the market in 5 years, but it's another pathway for some distilleries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's funny because I was just in Ireland and there's so many new distilleries and so many new brands, and they don't hide it at all. They own it. They're like, yeah, right now we're all sourced whiskey because they don't want to just sit on their thumbs until their whiskey ages. But, they're all very excited about pivoting away from it, but they, there's so much sourced whiskey going on in Ireland right now. But I think the alternative is, what are you going to do? Just make gin for 4 years until you're ready to sell a whiskey?
Yeah. And certainly it's a proven recipe, with Whistle Pig, with High West. Like that's how these brands have gotten by until they could start making their own distillate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because when I was in Germany last year, we went to St. Killian, and I was amazed. I mean, because this is not a little so I've been to Elk as well, and Elk is a brewery that is making whiskey. I mean, it was a brewery first, and Georg Kugler, who's the head brewer and the owner there, his expertise came from beer, and he's doing this, and it's very good whiskey. It was actually chosen. There was an event we were at called Jim McEwen and Friends, and he chose this as the German whiskey to be part of that event. So it's, in no way do I mean to imply that this is a lesser whiskey, but St. Killian was built from the ground up as a distillery, not as a brewery first. And so much so that they imported an Irishman to be their head distiller. But and the entire place was huge. I mean, it's for a new place that I don't mean huge by like Scottish standards or Kentucky standards. I mean, but it wasn't a little tiny. It was physically probably the size of Bruichladdich.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what their output is. I don't remember.
Not the Glenlivet expansions or the new Macallan distillery or anything, but
right. Although I will say the one cool thing that St. Killian did was they said that they wanted dunnage warehouses, but that's just not a thing in Germany. And then they found out that there was a disused NATO ammunition bunker that the army had abandoned when they closed in the 90s. And they bought they're subterranean bunkers, and they bought these bunkers that are intact. So they're like these NATO ammunition bunkers, hopefully now empty of ammunition.
Munitions and flammable liquids probably don't mix so well, but
oh man. Well, so anyway, in addition to talking about the world of whiskey and the future of whiskey, I would love to talk about what you're doing at the Beverage Testing Institute, and you were going to show us a couple little things here, and I'm happy to just shut up and learn.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the easiest thing, just in terms of quality of picture, I'll switch my background here to our tasting lab here.
Okay.
Even get out of the shot, so to speak. So conceptually, what we do is I'm moderating most of the panels. One of the owners here, my boss, Gerald, will invite him in to talk about the history of BTI a little bit here in a second as well. But what it looks like is, rather than fill in your blank famous whiskey taster who has a book, let's say Michael Jackson. It's not just me sitting down and tasting the whiskeys all by myself and giving my opinion. As much as I might think of myself and my background in whiskey and think that I've got a halfway decent palate and gone around the world and tasted a few of these things, it's still just my personal opinion at the end of the day. Do I like the whiskey? Do I not like the whiskey? Do I like a certain brand? What we do by blind tasting, similar to blind tasting wines, is try to take that personal bias out of it. But okay, I worked for Bruichladdich. It's pretty easy for me to spot a regular Bruichladdich in a blind lineup. I can tell the difference between Port Charlotte versus Lafroig or Lagavulin. That's not too hard if you've been tasting whiskey long enough to start to pick those things apart. What we do further is then having 4 or 5 people sit down at the same time, never tasting more than 20 samples of spirits, in an afternoon. And rather than a big tasting festival where you bring in bartenders or people and, taste through hundreds of products over the course of a couple days, or whether it's, one person tasting products all by themselves year round, we invite panels of experts to come in every morning to taste with myself, to do that 15, 20 products every morning, every work day of the year, to generate those blind tasting notes. So it's certainly a big commitment to having that much dedicated to tasting year round. And it's a lot of work in terms of getting people, mostly local to Chicago, but wanting to invite guests in. For anybody who doesn't know, I've invited Greg to come in, audit one of the panels. But again, what that means is to be an auditor is to, check out the software, be on one of the panels, have an independent internal review of the tasting notes that somebody like Greg would take, and then say, okay, we're going to make this person actually a judge and have their scores count as part of the algorithm with the other 3 or 4 people in the room at the same time. So we're always actively recruiting people and wanting to bring in guest judges. So somebody like Lou Bryson, famous whiskey author, friends of Gerald. He's known BTI for a long time. He's somebody who, when he's in Chicago, he'll pass through, he'll be in the office, occasionally sitting on panels. And so it's collecting the data from famous whiskey writers and people who have been in the industry a long time, along with beverage directors and, credentialed people here in Chicago, and putting all of our tasting notes together to come up with a, collaborative score as well as collaborative tasting notes. So it's not just me tasting figgy toffee pudding and saying, this is what this particular Speyside malt tastes like. We're trying to hit a wider target and say that by having 4 or 5 people tasting at the same time, we're going to have a more comprehensive tasting note along with a more comprehensive score that just doesn't reflect one person's nose and palate or individual bias on a particular style of scotch.
That's really fascinating. We had a scene. It actually got cut from the movie. We tried very hard to get it in, but Charles McLean explained to us. He was specifically talking about the Diageo tasting panel, but it was and there was this kind of aspect of also analyzing the analysts, where he said if one person was completely out of sync with everyone else, then they were supposed to fill in this questionnaire like, did you eat curry yesterday? Mm-hmm. There was a whole bunch. That was the one that made me laugh. But there was a lot of these very specific things that, did you start smoking cigarettes?
And we will talk through those things. So, we'll go through a flight of whiskey, say 3 whiskeys at a time, and then go through and, talk qualitatively what everybody's tasting. Is anybody getting any distillation flaws? Is anybody getting any sulfur that's coming through in the barrels? If we're not at least similarly aligned on the quality, and, if somebody thinks it's good and I think it's very good, like, okay, we're close enough. And we go by a quartermaster scale rather than, 90 versus 92 points. So, we're talking qualitative bands, and then it gets run through a proprietary algorithm, generates a score on the back end. But the issues are like, if you think this is a, low quality product or borderline commercially acceptable, and I'm saying this is an excellent product, why are we at such a huge disparity? That rarely to never happens. But to your point, that's going to be when somebody, is kind of called out or questioned, or, are there 3 other people in the room who are somehow missing sulfur on a cask and you're the only one that's saying this is egregiously flawed, or, what's going on here?
So how many people will you have on a panel, like at a time on average?
5 people. So it'll be myself and 4 people every morning tasting through spirits. So
how do you compensate for sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so that's the way we found that's a comfortable number. Again, in terms of vetted, credentialed experts to kind of balance out the numbers and make sure that we have a consistent product in terms of our reviews. And again, we've sent that out to be independently reviewed by various data scientists to look at the fact that we have consistent data over 4 decades, where if we say, a qualitative band has changed for a product, it typically means the distiller's changed, the sourcing has changed, but there's something probably pretty large on the back end that's happening, rather than saying, we've made a big change in terms of our methodology.
So how do you hedge against palate fatigue?
So that's why we never taste more than 20 products, typically more than 15. I prefer sparkling water and white bread in between flights, but typically water, some sort of neutral food item, and doing those 15 items over the course of 2 hours. So we're really taking 6-7 minutes per item, obviously spitting everything. Even over 2 hours, 15 drinks would definitely get everybody in the room completely wasted if we weren't spitting. So, doing everything that we can there to methodically look at the quality of the product, assess the production of the product, and give critical feedback of what we're tasting and smelling. And again, when we have enough products, when we have enough things going on, then Gerald will step in, and if we need to break it into multiple days to get through a month's workload, then there'll be afternoon versus morning sessions. But then I won't be tasting again until the next day, because you don't want to have that palate fatigue of more than 15 spirits in a day to really keep a fresh palate and a fresh nose on what's going on.
And I imagine, if you're doing a peated whiskey or something, that's going to have to come just like at a regular tasting. That's got to be at the end of
exactly. So again, in addition to tasting all these things blind, we have a production team that is looking at all the products that come in. I never get to know what they are, and then properly flighting them. So, starting with something that's low ABV, that's probably from Speyside, and then working your way up to cask strength and peated items, or things with a heavy sherry influence, flighted towards the end. And same thing, we'll break it up day over day of, okay, let's look at lighter whiskeys this day and flight them according to cask strength. And, comparative analysis, let's look at Islay whiskeys on the same day and go from something that's, 40% to things that are 45, 50 to cask strength, and on the back end looking at what are the phenols and flighting that and adjusting that properly as well. So all things that I never get to see in terms of the process. I'm just served the blind glasses, but trusting the process that, we have knowledgeable staff and people here that are looking at all those elements as to how to properly flight the whiskey from lightest to heaviest, most delicate flavors to heaviest flavors, to look at them even within that small range of just 15 whiskeys in a day.
So do you ever do things where the variable between A, B, C, and D is age, but it's the same spirit?
We do that, not necessarily in terms of when we're looking at clients' products, but internally in terms of evaluating judges, we'll do triangle testing. And so, again, multiple flights of basically Sesame Street of one of these things is not like the others, but you have to figure it out all by your nose.
The most interesting one of those I've ever done was a Glenfarclas one, which and Glenfarclas is really good for that because Glenfarclas is such a specific flavor profile in general across the. They're not going everywhere from like a Bruichladdich Isla barley to an Octomore, or even just within the Bruichladdich line. Like there's Glenfarclas is Glenfarclas, especially their official bottlings. And so we did one with
200 different types of casks in the warehouse.
Right. Yeah. So you can kind of reduce the variable down to age. Obviously that's never perfect, but you can do your best. Especially this was just a consumer tasting. This wasn't in a lab. This wasn't a professional thing. This was just the Southern California Whiskey Club doing it. But it went everywhere from like a 10 to a 50.
Yeah. And those are really
and
tough.
My favorite was the 25, so I bought one.
I love the Glenfarclas 25. It's definitely a benchmark for me in a go-to, especially with the way whiskey prices are going. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag or have anybody stockpiling my favorite whiskeys the way that it's gone with bourbon. But Glenfarclas 25 is a fantastic value, and I love the fact that they haven't changed their pricing too egregiously to chase after Macallan 25 pricing.
Yeah. Someone said to us, I think it was Blair Bowman, said to us in one of the interviews we did with him that, some brands, he was talking about Glenfarclas, are so consistently them that he said their idea of a special, you have like Macallan doing like Lalique decanters and all this stuff. He said Glenfarclas's idea of a special release is to put a different color paper in the printer. And which I thought was great. I've moved on to the St. Killian, the Gravedigger.
Nice. And those kind of tastings are incredibly valuable in terms of, assessing your palate as a consumer, assessing palates for us as judges. And yeah, like Glenfarclas 10 versus Glenfarclas 12, it's difficult. You put 3 glasses in front of you, 2 of the 10-year, 1 is the 12-year. It's not easy to find the 12-year. But, when you get to the 17, the 21, the 25, and you start to find like where are the differences in age statement, how much is the sherry influence impacting the base distillate? You start to find those things and you learn a lot from it.
Yeah. It was one of my favorite tastings I've ever done. I'll be honest. I learned a lot that night just about the wood influence and what it does. And by, removing everything else from the variable list, that it was that much more apparent. You didn't have to try to wrap your head around, wait, is that a different cask, or is that, you knew this, all that was different was the number.
Yep. One of my favorite things in whiskey, and kind of how I got bit really hard by the whiskey bug, was playing around with whiskey and wine casks. And working with Macallan, it was a huge eye opener. Actually, drinking Oloroso sherry next to Macallan, and really starting to pick out the individual influences. But long before that, it was a cask of Springbank aged in Gaia Barolo barrels. That was just kind of an aha moment for me of, what in the world is going on? I know that I like Springbank. I know that I like Barolo. Like, what is this wine doing to my whiskey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've never done that really with wine cask finish. I'd like to. I'm a big fan. I've had a handful, maybe 3 or 4 different Bruichladdich that are reef salts finished. And I love them. All of them. They are among my favorites. Yet I don't think I've ever had reef salts wine in my life.
Another wine I've got in my cellar, so we can fix that next time we get together in real life. And
I need to go to Chicago.
I'll try to manifest this into the universe. Talked about it with Simon a couple of years ago, but when Bruichladdich did that 16-year-old series in the first growth Bordeaux casks, per Simon, if the 3 of us can get together with dinner and a couple of clients, to do these side by side of the 5 first growth Bordeaux's, and he's got all the Bruichladdich 16s in those original casks. He's got some of them. He's previously said he'd supply them. I would love to get us together, do that kind of dinner, and look at the side by side of here's 5 different Bordeaux's in the 5 different Bordeaux casks and taste through the individual differences.
All right, fine, I'll do it.
I'm sure there's a couple people in the audience. I know Paul's amongst them that would jump at the opportunity to sit down at that dinner too.
Yeah, I really, I mean, actually, the truth is, I'm going to be in Chicago on Thursday. I'm flying to Germany Thursday night, and I do fly from LA to Chicago to Munich, but I'm going to be in O'Hare for like an hour.
Yeah, never really leave O'Hare.
Yeah,
we
can do it there.
Experience well.
No, we actually have some other stuff we need to do in Chicago anyways with the film. So I'm going to make that happen at some point. It's funny. I saw that Paul in the chat earlier said he's looking forward to, he's hoping to get to try the new Bruichladdich rye someday. Well, Paul, you can't hold me to this, but I know you're going to Scotland with me in June, and I think you're probably going to get to try it there. I think that's a foregone conclusion.
Love those shipping laws. I've already ordered a couple of bottles. Just need to find a way to get them into Illinois legally.
It's funny. I've had the Bruichladdich rye twice because it was one of the whiskeys at last year's masterclass at the festival, and then I had it literally the day before the pandemic began. Really, when I was in Germany at where I met Georg with the Jim McEwen and friends, they poured it there. It had just become whiskey, and that was really cool to try. It was the same whiskey. Speaking of the age statement being the difference, that was literally trying the same whiskey 3 years later, and now it's another year older.
And that's one of those things that, I'm really hoping with all these new distilleries, purpose-built distilleries, focusing on being sustainable, focusing on, a zero carbon footprint. I'm also hoping that, there's distilleries kind of like Bruichladdich that are looking at what are rotational crops. One of the reasons for having rye on Islay is, putting nutrients back into the soil that are pulled out by barley, and being able to rotate those crops and looking at, how do you do that for long-term sustainability of agriculture, back into distillation. I'm very optimistic that that's part of this new whiskey trend, is that eco-friendly distillation.
I think I'm going to be hopeful and say I think it is. It just seems to be. I know Bruichladdich was the first distillery to get the B Corp status. Now I think there's a lot that have a lot. I mean, you see it popping up all over the place.
And I love that. So here's hoping.
Yeah. I saw the guy asked us, what does a Glenfarclas 21 cost in the States? I don't know. It's been a couple of years since I bought one. But a couple hundred, it's way less than a Macallan 21. I'll tell you that. Way less.
I'd have to
remove a zero.
State by state. It's always a little bit of a cheat code having Binny's here in Chicago for some of the lowest pricing in the country. But I believe it's still under $200 a bottle for Glenfarclas 21 here. So
yeah, I think you're right.
Pretty much a steal.
Well, since to pivot back to the beverage testing again, I know that we have Gerald. Would you like to bring Gerald in and have him join us here for a sec?
Yeah, we can have him here. So, for anybody who doesn't know, and most people who know the Beverage Testing Institute know Gerald very well, especially here in Chicago, but also throughout the world. He's had a chance to work with Kavalan and a number of other distillers. So we'll
Hey there.
There's the history and what's led to the.
Oh, wait a second. I'm going to have to mute one of you guys. You're getting a big echo.
Oh no! Hello.
Hi, Gerald.
Hi, Greg. How are you doing?
Yeah. Very well, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've just been.
I'm hearing myself
chilling out in the green room
through your feed.
Oh, you know what? Let me bring that way down here. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, great. Then we can unmute Andrew. I think Andrew has muted himself. Hopefully it'll work.
Hopefully it'll work.
Yeah.
So good to be
Well,
with you. I've been on the green room just listening to the conversation with fascination. So I'm glad to be part of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to come there. I want to experience this firsthand. But I'm like we've been joking.
Yeah.
I'm finding it impossible to get myself to Chicago these days.
Well, you picked a good time not to be here, so don't come until it's nice here. So give us about another month, and it'll be worth your while to come here. It's pretty brutal during the winter.
I love Chicago. I've been there loads of times, and I'm still getting my feedback through there. I don't know who I'm hearing myself from. No, I think it's from Gerald.
It's probably me. Let me see.
But I'm. Let me. I can mute you for a second and then unmute you when I'm done talking. How about that? So I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the only way to fly from Los Angeles to Harrisburg is to go through Chicago. So dozens of times going to visit family and stuff like that, I would build trips in where I would have layovers in Chicago, like leaving O'Hare, actually staying for a few days and stuff. So I've been there, but it's been a while, pre-pandemic. So
excellent. Very cool.
We'll definitely make that happen with a Chicago trip. Maybe Detroit, Kentucky, for all the cool things that are going on in Midwestern distilling.
Mm-hmm.
That would be awesome.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we were exploring was prohibition. We've been talking about some different projects I'm developing and everything. And Charles McLean told us, speaking of when you said Detroit, Andrew, it reminded me of this. Charles McLean told us about a tavern that existed right across the lake in, I believe, London, Ontario, or near London, Ontario, that prior to Prohibition was going through about 8 to 10 cases of whiskey a year. And then after the year after Prohibition began was going through about 10,000 cases of whiskey a year because the owner's son was a fisherman. And you can just fill in the blanks on your own. I've always wanted to go there. I don't think that the tavern is there anymore, he said, but I always thought it'd be a good comedy.
It's tough to talk about whiskey and the Midwest without bringing in Chicago and Detroit, the Purple Gang and Al Capone, and kind of the long history of whiskey and prohibition there.
Absolutely.
I mean, to this day, it's still one of the reasons we get bigger allocations of bourbon than any other city. Is Chicago remained a bourbon drinking, whiskey drinking town when a lot of the rest of the country was drinking appletini and all things vodka.
Also super competitive. I was just going to say, also super competitive town in terms of, brands vying for price and market share. It's where a lot of people come to actually train their sales staff. I know for years, Gallo would send their sales staff to Chicago to train just because it was such a competitive market and you had to kind of learn how to survive as a brand here. So yeah, and I think even like something like BT, wasn't it, Buffalo Trace launched here right after, I think maybe they had one place in Indiana and then Chicago was the next launch market for Buffalo Trace. So yeah, we have that history.
No, that's interesting. One of the things that I'm a Pennsylvanian originally, and one of the things that I was looking at over the last couple of years, because I'm going to Germany next week because we're making a film right now about German beer and the history of German beer and the cultural role that's always played. And one of the things that speaking of Lou, is I've spoken with Lou a number of times. Lou and I have not yet met in person, but we've spoken a number of times because he's also a beer expert. And what a huge role Pennsylvania played in brewing because of the German influence pre-Prohibition, and almost all those breweries are gone. I mean, 99% of them never came back.
Right.
But they were everywhere.
And I still have to drink Yuengling when I go out to the East Coast.
The bartender here in LA told me that Yuengling is the best bad beer in the world.
It's up there. I have to feud between Yuengling and my Wisconsin roots on some of the PBR and old school Wisconsin beers that have survived forever.
Yeah, but on the whiskey side of things, Pennsylvania is a liquor wasteland because of the Liquor Control Board. I know there's a big history of whiskey distilling in Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion and all that, but that's long gone. my best friend still lives in Pennsylvania, and I tease him all the time about the fact that what I can buy and where I can buy it and how much I have to pay for it, even though I'm twice as far away from where it was made. And he found a quote. There was a guy named Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot was the head of Prohibition for a while. He's Pennsylvania, became the governor of Pennsylvania. And my best friend found this quote from him that said, once Prohibition was repealed, his goal was to make it as expensive and inconvenient as possible. Well, mission accomplished.
Yeah, right. Totally.
So, anything else that you guys want to talk about as far as what, the mission at the Beverage Testing Institute, I'd love to hear. I know that, we kind of got a nice look at the place, but it's and what you guys do. But, if there's anything else you want to share with me, please let me know, because I'm really curious about it. And I think a lot of people are, because a lot of people just don't see that side of the industry.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we've existed as such a B2B resource for the industry for a long time. We have a consumer footprint with our tastings.com website. We were actually the first organization to publish wine, beer, and spirits reviews online back in the mid '90s. If you know anything about the history of AOL, before it was AOL, it was LA Online, believe it or not. And we did the first wine and drinks channel on AOL back in the day. So, we've sort of had this split identity. We're part magazine, we're part competition, we're part agency and resource, for research and analysis. So it's tough to sort of juggle all of those brands, so to speak, and promote just kind of one channel of those. But we try our best. So yeah, we're doing a lot these days. I think the team that we have right now is really one of the best we've ever had. And we're very ambitious, and we want to kind of get our name out there, not just in the trade, but with consumers, and get people to, recognize the consistency and, kind of care that we put into our reviews and our analyses, and get retailers to use our shelf talkers, and, hopefully help people find things that they'll love, and really make some discoveries. And so we've been amping up the content thanks to Andrew and Amy Heyer that we recently hired, to really focus on framing not just the raw data that we kind of churn out every month in terms of notes and ratings and reviews, but to really frame it for the industry and for consumers, so that they can understand really the discoveries that we are making in a tasting room. You talked a lot about epiphanies that you've had tasting products through the years. I mean, that really happens on a daily basis with us for a lot of different with a lot of different people that we collaborate with. So it's finding a way to kind of share those insights and surprises that we're finding with our audience is really our next kind of chapter in our evolution, and finding ways to communicate those things that are both intellectually interesting and just purely hedonically indulgent and wonderful, and we want people to know about.
Well, that's awesome. That's really great. It's funny. It brings to mind, and I wasn't anticipating talking about this, so I didn't do my prep for this, but one of my good friend and our cinematographer from our film is very into wine, and he told me a story about a wine. God, I know his name. It's going to come to me after we finish this. Who was a wine taster, a very, very influential wine reviewer in the 80s. And basically, the feeling was that he had so much influence that he changed the industry. He had too much influence because the industry slowly started making what he liked. Robert Parker. Yes, Robert Parker. Yes. And it was an article from the New Yorker about that he had so much influence that it kind of pulled the entire industry towards his personal tastes.
Yeah. And that's definitely part of the panel appeal here, and part of the methodology that Gerald's been part of for 2 decades. And what we were founded on, and one of the reasons that I wanted to come here was I have that brand ambassador experience. I love going out and doing events and telling people about what we do. But what we do isn't just myself or just Gerald or any one palate or team member. It's really about trying to bring the industry forward and make products better for the consumer, and get into the nerdiness that we want to talk about here, and what what makes each product special and unique. So, we give an asset to brands. Part of the history here, and one of the things that was really cool and appealing was we were tasting Pappy Van Winkle back in 1997 and going, oh, damn, this is an incredible product. Long before, Anthony Bourdain was drinking it, or, it blew up in, 2010, 2011 into a, auctionable product. It was, being that tip of the spear, and, where is flavor and quality, and, where is a great quality product for the value long before, other people are looking at it. So that's one of my hopes in being here, is that, looking at these new distilleries, looking at, new Indian whiskey, or, whiskey coming out of Australia, and getting ahead of that curve of who's doing it right, and what's something really cool to drink, before it becomes a $200 bottle.
Right. That's great. And I really dig that, and really have enjoyed talking with you guys. This happens to me all the time. I look forward to this so much. I wind up talking with you guys, with my guests, right up until I always say, I said to you, Andrew, yesterday, I always say 45 minutes, but that's bullshit. It always goes an hour.
Keep it under an hour. We can keep the longer conversations for a future visit to Chicago. We can go visit Mike Miller over at Delilah's, and go play in his whiskey hoard of thousands of backlogged bottles.
Deal.
Definitely.
Well, thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been really enlightening, and I'm looking forward to it. And today's episode has been brought to you by the city of Chicago. I'll come.
I owe you a visit in LA sometime soon as well.
Deal. And one thing I need to say to everyone who watches this, I will not be doing this for the next couple of weeks. This is the last one until I get back from Germany, because I'm going to be shooting for 3 weeks. So we'll be back here on, I believe, April 21st. But until then, thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Cheers. I don't want to toast with an empty glass.